would be great. It'd be a heck of a lot better if the entire county was doing it and kicking in.
Councilmember Marshall, I'm sorry.
Sorry, I want to just chime in and respond to Deputy Mayor Habig. I really appreciate those comments, and I will emphasize just how this work actually began with the vision of moving forward a collective, unfragmented funding source that's countywide. And that work continues. We have conversations that are ongoing with King County to understand where they would land in this work. We also have conversations with Seattle, so we understand the coordination of their 2023 levy renewal and how it could tie with this effort. So I think I didn't emphasize that piece of the work continues to move in terms of conversations. And then there's the other piece of the East Side cities facing the expansive growth that you are facing and really calling on you to step up the revenue tools that can be available, whether that's in 2022 or 2023, while we're talking about the regional approach. And then we have the opportunity in Seattle with the new mayoral administration as well for some open conversations.
Councilmember Marshall.
Oh, I had no question. Thank you.
Anyone else? Ms. Malaba, do you have anything else for us?
Well, I will close by thanking you and the council for the great work and the prioritization of affordable housing that we've seen over the years. And we really appreciate all of your efforts. And we hope to be working in partnership with you in advancing a housing levy, whether it is within the city of Canmore or we end up with a regional option. This is really important work, and I do appreciate that this is a top one priority for all of you.
It is indeed. We have made that very clear. So thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. And I'm sure we will be speaking again. Next item on our agenda is the consent agenda. Is there a motion?
So moved.
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor kindly say aye.
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 Opposed? Consent agenda passes unanimously. Next item on the agenda is the amendments to the Kenmore tree regulations presented by the Development Services Director, Mr. Brian Hampson, and Senior Planner, Samantha Loyak.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss this topic with you again. We do have Samantha Loyak with us today, but we are here tonight to go over our recommended code tree regulation amendments with you. Mainly, we want to circle back with you to make sure that we're on the same page, accurately capturing what you wanted us to change on these 5 topics that we discussed with you before. So while there is no formal action tonight, we do need feedback and direction from you. So if you're in support of what we're proposing, or if you'd like to make some amendments, just let us know as we go through the presentation. So I will start the slideshow and then kick it over to Samantha.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us back. Before we get started, well, Brian is actually going to run the presentation. We'll go through it together, and then I'll just kind of speak on the different topics. But I just wanted to kind of go over where we're at and how we got here without taking too much of your time. But at the January 8th and 9th, 2021 City Council retreat, there was discussion of tree preservation, and that was identified as a priority, and council requested to conduct an informational tree workshop. And then in April, Brian and I provided an informational presentation to summarize the existing tree regulations. And as part of that presentation, we discussed potential code amendments that were intended to promote and enhance tree preservation in Kenmore. So to further Kenmore's urban forest. And so these recommendations were provided in list 1 and list 2. We came back in May, at the end of May, to discuss list 1 and 2 in greater detail, and to, just get your guys' sign off on those and give your okay to move forward. And then in July, we submitted our final proposal for the King County, King Conservation District, KCD, 2021 Urban Forestry Health Management Grant. So we applied for that. And during this time, we also received preliminary approval to have a tree canopy assessment. And then in September, you heard from Garrett. He presented a policy paper. And then and now you're hearing from Brian and I. So we've kind of moved along, throughout the year, and are continuing to have these touch points on tree discussions. And also in November, I met with KCD and we talked about the tree giveaway event that they will be funding. So we're actively working on that. But tonight, we're going to talk about the tree regulation amendments that we were directed by council to move forward with, and these are all the items that are on list 1. So list 1 included 5 different items. Okay, and these items, we'll go ahead and we'll go through them, and then you will see as we continue with the slides that Brian, do you want to click through?
Can you see my slideshow?
Yes.
I can see the presentation, but I don't see that you've clicked it like from beginning. You should click from beginning.
Oh, I'm sharing the wrong screen then. Let me stop sharing and share the correct
Okay.
screen.
You're probably like, okay, Sam, get on it. How come you're not? But so as Brian's sharing that, we had 5 items. Number 1 is to change the definition of significant trees. So it includes smaller diameter trees. So that would provide greater protections for more trees. The second was to revise the tree retention requirements to exclude nuisance species so they don't receive any credit. Thanks, Brian. And the third one is to codify the tree removal application process for existing single family residences. This is a code cleanup item. And then number 4, also code cleanup, was to update the removal, the penalty language for removal without permission. So that's for consistency in the code. And then number 5 is to reduce the amount of time that permits are good for so that trees get planted into the ground faster. So we'll go through these one by one. So the first one is on the left side, you're going to see the current regulation. And then on the right side, we have the proposed language. And the way that we're going through these, we're just going to go through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but we want your feedback so that when we bring an ordinance to council, that it is as desired, that it's in the correct format, so that it can be approved. So this will be the opportunity to discuss these 5 different points and what changes should be made actually in the code. And keeping in mind, we have a list too, but that is not on for tonight. We are trying to get through list 1 so we can get some code changes made.
So let's stop after each one of the 5 and make sure that all questions are answered.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, I think that's a great idea. So on the left side here, this is our definition of a significant tree. So I won't read through each one of these, but essentially what this is doing is this is reducing it instead of the 8-inch or the 12-inch. It's just saying everything is 6 inches. Anything 6 inches or greater is a significant tree, which we will have the exception of nuisance species. So with that, we'll open it up for discussion. Deputy Mayor.
Is there, yes, Deputy Mayor.
So could you go over briefly what added protection significant trees have versus non-significant trees?
Sure. So once we say that they're significant, they become, that goes towards your yearly allowance of tree removal on your property. So if you had a tree on your property, let's say you had just a single family residence, no critical areas, assuming, and you wanted to remove a tree that was a 6-inch evergreen, 6-inch DBH, right now that would not be considered a significant tree, and so that could be removed. It's not regulated.
So you can cut down as many non-significant trees on your property as you want.
Assuming that you're not in any critical areas or buffers, and that those were not part of a tree plan. So if you were part of a planned development, those are designated. And then, so for single family, yes.
How long, like, let's say somebody builds a new development and, you know, it includes a tree plan. How long is that in effect? How long does that have teeth?
So what we do is we condition the final plat map. So all of those conditions, it says all lots within this short subdivision shall comply with the tree plan on file with the city of Kenmore. And so essentially that makes it a hard condition on the plat map. So that tree has protection for as long as it's going to live or become dangerous, essentially.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? Yes, Councilmember Shrubnik.
Yeah, my ignorance here. Why do we care that stumps are retained?
Do you want me to answer that, Samantha?
Yeah.
So sometimes trees get removed without permission.
Yeah.
And we need to have a way to assess the size of the tree. And by putting definition in here about the size of the stump, it gives us a better, what do you call it? Evidence of what we can actually support. And so if somebody was to cut down a significant tree that barely met the size to be a significant tree, it's really hard to prove it once somebody's cut it down. And so if we're looking at the stump and we could say, okay, now we actually have a size for the stump, that if the stump's in place, this is what we'll consider as a significant tree. So it's pretty much after the fact people cut it down.
Oh.
Give us a way to prove, or not prove, to assess, you know, the tree itself of what it was.
So this isn't about okay, I guess I was interpreting it as significant trees we want to preserve. And then I saw the stump language and I was like, well, wouldn't you want to like put a real tree in there instead of a stump? Yeah, so I was struggling with that, but yeah, so maybe that's explained elsewhere. I don't know.
Can I add to that, Brian? So I think that it's, if we've had a code violation and somebody says, well, how do you know that's significant? You
Yeah.
measure it at 4.5 feet, right? So we want to be able to say we assessed it based on this and it's supported by the code. Otherwise, it presents a challenge when, you know, we go in front of the hearing examiner and then we could be challenged on something like that.
Deputy Mayor.
I guess my point was, so if somebody wants to remove a stump that maybe has been there for 20 years, I'm struggling with why that should be considered, you know, and they want to put trees in, real trees. Why should we consider that significant? So, I mean, yes, we want to enforce the code and maybe we can use this definition to provide evidence that someone just cut down their tree, but I see problems with it, I guess.
I see what you're saying, but I think it's more for trees that have been removed without permission and we were to follow up after the fact. It's not
Yeah.
necessarily saying that you would consider a stump a significant tree and may have to do some, get a permit or anything like that.
Well, then, yeah, maybe that's, if you can make sure that's clarified somewhere else in the code, that'd be great. Thank you.
Deputy Mayor?
How are significant trees treated differently when we're subdividing, a large plot?
Are you asking, are they treated differently for an
Yeah, I
existing
mean, my
family
major,
residence?
yeah,
Yeah.
versus a single, because, a single family can cut down 2 of these significant trees a year, kind of
Right.
regardless.
Yes. So
Um,
there are 2 different ways. So single family removal, the yearly is kind of, you use that chart. But for development proposals, they have a tree density requirement that they have to meet. So that's 30 tree units per net buildable acre. And so that's a calculation, and there's a translation table. 1 unit is not necessarily a tree. Greater units are given to trees that are larger.
Okay. My biggest concern right now personally is ensuring that we don't have any future complete clear cuts. I think even if most trees need to come down for a development, especially a single family housing development, I really think we need to figure out how to strengthen our code in such a way that preserves at least a couple older trees, just to add some character to these places rather than having a bunch of saplings plunked down. Because I know we can't do that currently, because they can just plant more little tiny trees that take forever to grow up. But I would really like us to find a way to, if there are larger, and maybe this is in the exceptional tree discussion that is in list 2, but I would like for us to find a place to protect at least some of the existing trees when a large plot is subdivided. That's something that, just a personal gripe of mine.
And I guess I would like to find a way to protect trees to prevent from happening again what happened last summer, where a large group of significant trees were literally clear cut.
So that would definitely be a list 2 item. That is, yeah, that's actually item number 2 on list 2. So that's something that you guys will likely discuss at your council retreat.
As long as it doesn't happen again before then.
I want to make sure that we've captured Council Member Shrebnick's concern. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Samantha, but there isn't anywhere else in the code that talks about the stump and the potentially for defining a stump as a significant tree.
Well, there's a definition of a tree. And so in that way, we would know that the stump is not a tree. But in my notes here for Council Member Shrebnick's comment, I said that we should clean up the language so it's not, it doesn't seem like it's claiming that a stump is a tree.
Okay, good.
I think we can do that.
Perfect.
Okay.
Ready for the next one, Mayor?
Yeah, I don't see any further questions on this one, so yes.
Great. So the second one speaks to development. And so currently in a development, it does not specify the tree credits that you receive. You could receive a lot of credits if you wanted to retain a cottonwood, would be of equal value as a Douglas fir tree. And so what we want to do is have developers retain good trees that can be there long-term, and to not give credit to some of these kind of nuisance species, which they have their place maybe in other settings, but probably not for tree retention and subdivisions.
I thought you were going to say other cities, which I would agree with you there.
No, maybe in a wetland.
Councilmember Marshall.
So are Cottonwood and Alder native?
That's a good question. I feel like they are, but there's some that I'd have to double check.
That's okay. Yeah, that's something of a factor in my thought. I'd always felt that the cottonwoods in Kenmore were a species of definite value and significance. And then it was only the letter or the email we saw from Mr. Eric Admin, who knows more about these things more so than me for sure. Seeing in them some value in terms of wetlands or around wetlands and other places. So I don't know. I was interested in his thought that there might be some middle ground between nuisance, maybe giving them some credit or minimal credit, as opposed to none whatsoever, so that we have some balance of that. That was my thought.
Yeah, and if I can respond to that, yeah, they do have definitely a place, especially in terms of, you know, wetlands and streams and their buffers. So those areas already receive protections. And as part of the critical areas code, mitigation work is often required, which would require planting species like cottonwood. And so because they are beneficial for those areas. So I think that the intention here is to say, you know, maybe for a single family, if it's in the backyard and we just built a new house, like that wouldn't be one that we're saying you're going to keep that one forever, you know, to get the same credit.
Also, we see it a lot on subdivisions where developers will want to try to use the alderwoods and cottonwoods and cut down a big fir tree that might be better to save, but they all meet the same definition. And because they want to put a particular element of their development somewhere, we're seeing cottonwoods and alders get credit, and so this would prevent that.
Yeah. And that's like the property owner moves in, they're like, I want to get rid of these. How come you let them save these junk trees? It's like, you know. So this is the proposed language. Oh, sorry.
Deputy Mayor.
For these sorts, excuse me, for these sorts of developments, is the current tree density on the lot part of the calculation, or is it just by size and use of the lot?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Is the tree dense? Let's say you have a big empty lot that you're going to put 5 houses on, and it's got a bunch of trees on it. Is that tree density part of the calculation, the existing tree density, or is it just the size of the lot and what the lot's going to be used for that dictates the tree density needed?
Just the size. Just the size of the lot.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Samantha. You want to know if this one, we've got anything that's concerning?
Correct. Yeah, is there any other comments on the proposed language for item number 2?
I have a question.
Yes, Councilmember Kugler.
Thank you. Samantha, can you remind me for new development in this situation, is each tree worth 1 tree credit, or do we have any like different levels of credits depending on tree species?
So the way it works, it's not 1 tree is 1 credit. So the credits, they'll say there's a table in 1857 that says if you have a 20-inch DBH tree, that translates to 4.2 tree units, right? So there's this table that tells us how much they're worth, but it doesn't say like, but if it's an alder, you don't get that many. It just says this size, it's a tree that's, healthy and good condition. This is the amount of credits.
But this will fix that, right?
This will remove these 3 from receiving any credit.
Great.
Can I ask a follow-up question then?
Certainly.
Thank you. So then are there cases where you would recommend keeping cottonwood or alder based off of placement on the land other than wetlands, where this might be worth some type of credit or unit?
Yeah, Brian, you can chime in. I have not seen, I feel like usually all the plans that I see, there are better trees to retain. It's so anytime we're retaining some of these, they seem to come back a few, years later that they're now a problem. This is, most people don't want a cottonwood right in their backyard. So yeah, what do you think, Brian?
I don't, I'm not familiar with any situations that occurred. Did I mess up the screen?
Yes.
I hit a button on my computer. Did I stop sharing?
No,
No,
you
you-
just increased the size.
How would I do? Now
You
what
got
do you?
rid of the slideshow.
Yeah, now we see your Word doc.
Oh, man.
Maybe stop and start again.
We got the agenda item. Summary.
Where's the IT when you need them?
We can probably, while you're doing that, Brian, we can probably still keep going with, looks like there's a question.
Yes, Councilmember File.
Thank you. I think addressing the issue of surrounding nuisance trees is really important for Kenmore's future and for, proper planning, good soil retention, stormwater runoff, and soil erosion purposes. I understand that cottonwoods are considered not only a nuisance species, but aren't necessarily native to Kenmore or our Pacific Northwest quite remotely. Given that they are a nuisance tree, like a holly tree is, I can't see where we'd want to encourage planting. So I'm happy to see a list of trees that would be recommended on a website, that like a website landing page, and a list of what not to plant. I think that clarification for our community and transparency would be easier to read rather than having to go through code. So I would like to see kind of a two-prong approach on these issues of our trees, whether it's significant trees or nuisance trees or recommended trees. And if I'm pretty certain that alder is a Pacific Northwest native tree. So I'm surprised that it's on this list. Is there a reason why?
It's on this list because I've come across it for other cities and jurisdictions where it's listed as a tree that you wouldn't consider significant. And so like City of Seattle has a list of them, and it's just typically that these are fast growing trees that don't have a long lifespan, and so protecting them can be challenging in that aspect.
Thank you.
So we agreement with number 2 here? It looks like we are.
Okay. Number 3. So this is just to codify the process that we have. We are doing this currently because it's our only way to track how many trees are removed. And so right now, a formal application, our code doesn't specifically say that. It just says, oh, if you're, this is how many you can remove per year, but there's no way for us to actually track that. So we ask that people provide an application for the tree removal of significant trees, and this would just solidify that.
So, I'm sorry, Deputy Mayor?
I was kind of curious what the enforcement mechanism or what the I'm curious what the enforcement mechanism looks like. I'm also curious what the kind of expectation is. Is this something where we make it known to landscape and tree companies and arborists and that sort of thing, that's the law for Kenmore, and that they need to go get a permit, like, a plumber would, or whatever? Or is there some other way that we make sure people are aware of this, and comply?
So in most jurisdictions, to remove a significant tree, you'll need a permit. It's pretty common for landscapers and arborists to say, hey, you probably need a permit for this. You need to check with the city. So there's not a lot of surprise unless we'll have the occasional property owner that's like, oh, I had no idea, which, I understand that, but professionals removing them certainly are aware that this is kind of a standard.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember File.
Thank you. I think it's great that we're going to recommend a permit for removal, so we can track these progresses. Yet, when we do have the occasion like we had this year with, property owner here or there who aggressively took out trees and took out more, depending on the kind of response they got, I think we need to possibly consider a fine associated with breaking the code. So I can see that we would also probably need to have some sort of socioeconomic bar level that could be applicable for a situation. And I'd want to make sure that we clarify that in the case of, property damage, house pipes or home risk, utility line risk, that those provisions are preempted from this regulation. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah.
And I am concerned about the 2 tree a year start. Do we have any sort of a plan for a mitigation plan? If there's to be anything more than 1, I would think. I think I'm concerned about starting with 2. Why are we starting with 2 trees? Why not start with 1? And if a second tree needs to be removed in a year, there should be some sort of a mitigation plan, in agreement with the city as part of the permitting process. That seemed logical, but it would be a benefit to protecting our tree canopy.
I think that's the main reason that it's on a future work plan. It's going to take a little bit more work for us to pull that together, put that mitigation plan together, and what those could look like. These were kind of a little easier to pick up this year. So when we do bring back future work plans, we could talk about the number of trees that can be cut down on single family. We can put that on our work plan. We could look at how much time it will actually take us to write that kind of code language and other parts to go with it.
Well, I think that's good. Is that, I'm not sure if that's in our part 2 work on tree canopy or not. It is?
Yeah,
Thank
it's
you.
item number 2 on list 2.
Thank you so much.
Councilmember O'Kane.
And this may be tying in with Councilmember Files' question, and it may be on the mitigation plan on the second list. But just in case, as I look at this, the question that comes to mind, and I can think of my property in particular. I've got lots of trees on my property. I have a 10,000 square foot lot. Most of it's not usable and has a lot of significant trees on it. But I could easily, in 3 years, cut down all of my trees at 4 trees per year. So is there a place that we're going to be able to possibly set a minimum requirement for single family homes or lots? I think, especially since we're requesting the permit and some form of review with tree removal, maybe there might be a way to say we need to at least keep this many trees. So is there a way to do that? Is this the time or later?
I think it is on list two, and I think it's all holistic. It's all comprehensive, the matter and the subject itself. And so those are all the things that we really need to look at when we're putting together this next part.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah,
Yeah.
and yeah, so definitely on the next part, I would like to see a minimum requirement if that's possible. Thank you.
That is also tied to list 2, number 2.
Yes, Councilmember Marshall and Councilmember Shrubnik.
Okay, and I got to thank Mr. Admin again for noticing the proposed language. I do think there needs to be an active permissive language, an active verb somewhere in there, but it would work right after removal of significant trees. It probably should say something like removal of significant trees is allowed on lots that contain existing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then at the end, you've got provided that an application shall be filed. So you got to have a verb somewhere in there after that, but please consult with the city attorney or otherwise, but I know you got to have a verb in there. I agree with him. Thanks.
Councilmember Shrubnik?
Yeah, I had that same thing to flag, except I had one other thing and now it's gone in my mind. It'll come back. Sorry.
And I guess I'm concerned that somebody could clear cut a lot over a period of time by removing 1 or 2 trees a year. And I sure don't want to see that happen. But that's probably on list 2 also.
It is on list 2, and I
remembered
understand.
my comment. Sorry. I think Samantha, you talked about tree cutting companies kind of knowing that permits are required. And I mean, my impression from talking to a number of them over the many years we've been here is they largely defer to the owner to take care of that, so to speak, to take care of it. And so I would not, I think there's education that needs to happen both on the business side and the community side. I do not agree that this is known.
Anybody else? Oh, Councilmember File. Your hand is up. Councilmember Kugler.
Thank you. Just to add to what Councilmember Marshall was saying, like I think this whole thing needs to be simplified. It's really hard to follow and get to the real meaning. I think that entire clause that was ended at the end is just very confusing to follow along. So I think it needs to be rewritten and simplified if possible.
Anything else? So are we in agreement with this then?
all right, we will rewrite it.
Yep.
Bring it up.
I've made some notes to
Good.
simplify and to clarify it
Number
with the
4.
same content. Okay, number 4, here we go, making progress. Okay, so this is to update the tree removal penalty language. This is, we'll refer to this to you, but we are, I think, the highest that I've ever seen for tree removal penalty. We were advised by the hearing examiner, I think once or twice even, that our fees were too high on this. And so this was a cleanup item for many years, and I open it up to discussion.
Discussion, comments, suggestions. Yeah, seeing some of the things that have happened over the years, I'm very happy with keeping them high. Councilmember Kugler.
Thank you. I'm wondering why the proposed language is may be assessed a monetary value up to instead of that they shall. Is this like, how will we determine the amount? And why is it like maybe you might be charged it instead of you will be charged it?
Brian.
So as Samantha was saying, it's this number is difficult to really get a judgment on in our favor all the time, unless it's really onerous. You know, we had a situation a couple of years back where a homeowner cut down some significant trees without a permit to increase the value of his, you know, of their property. You know, and so it was obvious that, you know, the cost that they actually had to pay for the penalty was not even, you know, as much as they increased the value of their house. Whereas if you had, as Councilmember Shrevenick mentioned, a tree cutter who came out and didn't inform a particular family or person that there was a tree that needed to be cut down, and it wasn't increased for certain reasons. It didn't have particular reasons with it. Maybe it wasn't as big of a deal, if you will, one that they could have gotten a permit for if they would have just come in and talked to us. It seems it's harder to get those judgments on those particular properties to say that's the same, you know, the price, the penalty is the same, $2,000 per the inch of the tree. And so there could be a situation where we could have a little bit of flexibility with the homeowner, depending on the situation that they're encouraging or encountering. But there is a not to be reduced to an amount less than $500 for the violation. So it's leaving a little bit of discretion to the city on that side of it.
Councilmember Shrevenick.
Yeah, I am kind of concurring with Councilmember Kugler as I'm seeing it now. You've kind of got a double out there. You've got may and up to, and I don't think you need both, right? You might need the up to comply with the court, but I don't think you also need the may in there. And I think that's confusing because that suggests there's other criteria that you're going to use to assess any fee at all. And I don't think we want that.
Councilmember File.
Thank you. So I also concur in the confusing language that would be hard for residents to likely interpret. And when I'm looking at the proposed language, I think it needs to be cleaned up. I also would recommend that if we started with a first violation of $500 for a significant tree of 6-inch diameter, right? Then the next corresponding violation, if a second violation was to be issued, should be double than that of the first. Much like when you're getting a ticket violation in court. If you go in once, it's $500. You go in twice, it's $1,000. I think that's fair, and it also shows there's a significant penalty, maybe something that would cause pause. But as we don't have a landmark tree case, I would want there to be a penalty for landmark trees when we get to the second phase. For removal without permit.
Anybody else? Councilmember Marshall?
I'm wondering with the idea of giving you more flexibility before the hearing examiner then, or whoever it was decided when it was said shall be, 2,000 and not the up to, no flexibility. Did the decisions then or the decision maker just blow out the 2,000 and say, okay, it's nothing? And thus you really do need to have this flexibility, or did they reduce it themselves, or can they reduce it themselves, the decision maker, the hearing examiner or the judge, whoever it was.
That particular case was settled, and so we formed a settlement agreement with the city and the property owner, and took it out of the hearing examiner's hands. But he or she, the hearing examiner, would have had to stay with that $2,000 per inch if it wasn't for the settlement agreement.
There was a case that went to the hearing examiner longer ago. It was, I don't know if you remember, Brian, it was a code violation, and it was a developer that removed it when we said, don't remove it. And they did. And then we did charge them the, whatever was calculated in the code, and it was a really large fee. I wish I hadn't remembered the number, but it was reduced at least by half by the hearing examiner. And they ended up paying that to us. Do you remember that, Brian?
I do. That was some time ago. I don't remember the details, and I don't remember the amounts.
Yeah.
But I remember the case.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Have you got what you need on this one?
Well, we've had some discussion on it, and I can clean up the language. It sounds like remove may, because you're kind of saying it twice, and you don't need that. And that could be maybe a little, so clean up the language that it may be too confusing in that area. I don't know if we got a consensus on the amounts, because I know council member File was talking about like almost like a tiered penalty.
Yeah.
And that's not what is set up here. So I want to make sure that going forward that, the amounts that we have in here are what is approved.
Well, I can certainly see a tiered system. You do it once, one thing, you do it again, you're going to pay more money. So, I mean, I certainly don't want to play around with these people, and there's a lot of thumbs up on that.
I see that. Okay. That makes sense. I just wanted to make sure before I made those edits that we were all in agreement on that. So seeing that
but we're certainly,
okay.
a lot of us are. Councilmember Kugler?
I'm in favor of giving the staff the flexibility they need in these situations to figure out like what you think is right. But I also worry about when policy is so flexible that staff don't know how to proceed. And I wonder if this might be the case when we're saying a monetary penalty up to $2,000 per inch in diameter. Like, how will you know if you're going to charge someone $500 per inch or $1,000 per inch or $1,500 per inch or $2,000 per inch? Like, is this like, do we need to refine this part a little bit?
So in response, okay, I'll just say something then over to you, Brian, but I just kind of wonder, is it like, how egregious is it? Because we've had an instance where we're like in writing, we said, developer, you can't remove these, right? We're actively reviewing, like a permit. And we're saying, don't do it. Make sure you don't do it. You have these corrections, right? And then they remove it. So, I mean, instances like that, I like the flexibility that it's so clear that we're saying, yeah, you do, versus, a property owner, that's saying, hey, my neighbor has this, view easement. And they told me I have to remove this tree. And then I removed it. And now I didn't know I could remove it. So it's across the board, but yeah, go ahead, Brian.
No, that was well said. I don't have anything to add.
Councilmember File?
This is where I think additional language would be helpful. So if you had a significant tree and then kind of level, and then you have a like landmark tree level. I think having some hard hitters and some clear benchmarks is making the code it'd make the code a little easier to apply and read, as well as what we had already prior discussed with the tiered system. I think anything you can do to just clean it up so it's not going to be hard to reinterpret, because we know that most courts, when people go to challenge something, is oftentimes a judge will reduce a fine, fee, or penalty down to 50%. So I'm thinking about that on the long term, and thinking about, what our developers are thinking, or the property owner who doesn't give a darn and is happy to pay, $2,000, $10,000, $40K, right? Because that can happen. Where they're so motivated, they don't care what the penalty is, it's worth it to them. I think we have to make it sting, and we have to make it stick. So I think cleaning up the language, if we can apply benchmarks, I think that would offer clarification to help us stick.
Anybody else? We okay on this, Sam?
I think I have what I need.
Okay. Number 5.
Okay, this one's pretty straightforward. So we would change the amount of time that tree permits are valid. Right now it's 2 years. So you have 2 years to essentially remove it. And then if there are conditions to replant, you have that whole time period, versus the proposed language being 1 year. Is there any discussion on that?
No, I think 1 year is good.
Okay. And that got us through all 5 of them.
I want to make sure I got others on the council that agree, not just me saying 1 year is good.
Well, I did see a thumbs up, but you're right. You're
Okay.
right. Let's get a
Okay.
few more nods.
We got a few more.
So what our plan moving forward will be to, sounds like, to make some of these adjustments and then bring forth the ordinance, since it's pretty clear. I've taken notes on it, so I feel like I can make the code language and get it back to you guys.
Okay.
All right.
All right.
Well, thank you.
All right. Thanks,
Okay.
everyone.
No, thank you, guys. You're clear on everything, right?
Yep.
Okay, 'tis the season, Sam. You go back being the director of fun.
Got it.
All right. Traffic photo enforcement by traffic engineer Tobin Bennett. And it's our second time looking at this one.
Mayor Baker, just wait 1 second while Mr. Bennett Gold joins us. I just promoted him.
Okay, it looks like I'm here now. Okay, great. Give me just a moment to set up my screen sharing. Okay, are we looking at my presentation now? Okay, great. Good evening, Council. Thank you for having me back. It's been about a month since we last spoke, and I hope you all are excited for the next installment of this discussion. At the November 8th Council meeting, I provided an overview of the program goals and program structure, and most importantly, how the proposed photo enforcement program will be a service to our residents, which increases safety for our most vulnerable road users and provides for continued investment in the maintenance and safety of our roadways, while sharing the cost of those programs in a way that is equitable, fair, and consistent with our city's values. Automated photo enforcement was recommended in 2014 by the Ad Hoc Committee on Pedestrian and Bicycle Safety, and Kenmore City Council included automated photo enforcement as part of the 2020 Financial Sustainability Plan to provide a sustainable source of revenue for our existing maintenance and safety improvement costs. Today, I have some additional discussion prepared on questions that came up after last month's presentation. And I also have some discussion on council's comments that were passed along to me in the intervening time. Lastly, I have some new material too, which we haven't discussed yet, regarding how school zone hours are set, considerations for revenue and cost estimation, and then a brief overview of site selection and considerations and recommendations. Pending what additional feedback we receive regarding the proposed photo enforcement program, we anticipate seeking council approval after a public hearing at the January 24th council meeting. After the photo enforcement presentation of the November 8th council meeting, Deputy Mayor Herbig asked about the proposed fine schedule and about why the threshold speed for a higher tier of school zone speeding was relative to the underlying regulatory speed limit and not based on the fixed threshold above the school zone speed limit. I mentioned that this had to do with information about the traffic environment being baked into the regulatory speed limit, and that's true, and I'll talk more about that in a moment, but there were a few other important considerations that I didn't think to touch on at the time. The first one is one that came up during legal review for the recommended changes to the municipal code regarding photo enforcement, including a graduated fine schedule. When discussing vulnerabilities the code may have to legal challenge, our prosecutor noted that if we implemented a tiered system, it could be challenged on the basis of the division between the tiers being arbitrary. That is to say, in the case of setting a threshold at 35 miles per hour for an increased fine amount, the challenge might be that 36 miles per hour is not substantially different than 34 miles per hour. So on what merit is the penalty different? Basing the increased fine amount on the regulatory speed limit piggybacks on the authority of the regulatory speed limit in order to make that threshold for higher tier fines clearly non-arbitrary. This is because the regulatory speed limit itself is not arbitrary, but rather a decision based on engineering review. An ongoing review of speed limits is in fact in process right now, and I anticipate we'll have a presentation to council with recommendations regarding speed limits in early 2022, including speed limits on many of the roads where photo enforcement is currently being considered. The second consideration regarding tying the threshold for an increased fine to the regulatory speed limit is one that I mentioned before, that when the speed limit is the result of an engineering review, the speed limit contains information about the speeds which are appropriate for that traffic environment. I want to provide some context to this notion by discussing a few locations, each with uncontrolled school crosswalks, but differing speed limits in traffic environments. I didn't take these pictures myself, but I stole them unscrupulously from Google Street View. From top to bottom, what we're looking at here are the approaches to uncontrolled school crosswalks on 73rd Avenue near Kinmore Elementary, 155th Street near Morelands Elementary, and 81st Avenue near Morelands Elementary. These locations differ in speed limit and in roadway classification, and each of them is a pretty typical example of other locations with the same respective speed limit and classification. On our higher speed, higher classification roads, we expect to see more access control, meaning fewer locations where vehicles, cyclists, and pedestrians can enter traffic. The frequency of driveways and side streets increases as we decrease roadway classification, and we need to be aware, and the need to be aware of other road users suddenly entering traffic is one that is reflected in the lower speed limits for lower classification roadways. Channelization and pavement markings are present on all roads and all speed limits and all classifications, though channelization is uniformly present on all higher classification roadways and only applied on an as-needed case-by-case basis on local roads. The reason for this is that channelization constricts the use of the traveled way in favor of motor vehicle travel, while unchannelized roads provide more flexibility for a shared use environment. A shared use environment is desirable on local roads, and an unmarked roadway is a clear context cue to drivers that engagement and awareness are needed to navigate the traffic environment. Providing unnecessarily channelization in this environment would encourage drivers to behave in a manner more similar to what is appropriate on a higher speed roadway, and having unchannelized roadways is generally effective at helping to encourage lower speeds in an environment where lower speeds are appropriate. When drivers do travel at higher speeds in a low speed local road environment, however, the risk they subject other road users to is greater than if they had the same behavior in an environment built for higher speeds. Environments that are built for higher speeds are also more likely to have features which separate vulnerable road users from motorized vehicles. Features such as sidewalks or buffered bike lanes are similar. These sorts of facilities may be absent or less complete on lower speed and lower classification roadways. In a perfect world, we could set the rules for each specific location on a case-by-case basis, but given the constraints for defining a system programmatically, using the regulatory speed limit is a good proxy to help account for what the in-place traffic environment might look like. That is, of course, only if we assume that the speed limits are set judiciously, making sure we monitor our diverse traffic environments and set speed limits that are well matched and appropriate is something that is an ongoing process that should be revisited periodically. Again, setting speed limits is a topic for another discussion, but I did want to make the point that there are a lot of moving parts here, and photo enforcement is not a change that would be made in isolation of other engineering processes in the city. The last consideration I want to add regarding setting a graduated fine schedule, which is tied to the regulatory speed limit, is that each fine amount serves a different purpose. The lower fine serves as a reminder to drivers to monitor their speed and to make a better effort to recognize and respect the school zone environment when the school zone speed limits are in effect. The higher fine is to give photo enforcement enough teeth to discourage deliberate, reckless speeding behavior. The expectation is that this lower fine amount covers the majority of drivers who are speeding, and the higher fine amount is reserved for drivers who are not participating in normal behavior, the speeding outliers. What speed behavior is normal for drivers takes cues from the traffic environment, which is in turn reflected in the speed limit. I want to take a moment to illustrate how this looks with real speed data, applying different speed threshold rules to show which drivers are captured depending on where the threshold lies. On the left, we have two school zones with regulatory speeds of 35 miles per hour. The top one is Juanita Drive near Earhart Elementary, and the bottom one is 73rd Avenue near Kilmore Elementary. On the right, we have two school zones where the regulatory speed limit is 25 miles per hour. The top one is 155th Street near Moreland Elementary, and the bottom one is 71st Avenue near Kenmore Elementary. These are the speeds measured during school zone active hours in 2019. The top row are two locations with very poor compliance, dismal compliance, you might say, if you want to be dramatic about it. But the bottom row is more typical school zone compliance. If you notice that the very first bar contains all the vehicles traveling less than 21 miles per hour, that is to say, all the vehicles driving at the school zone speed limit are lower, then you can guess why I would not call any of these good compliance. Though credit should go to 71st Avenue for being the only school zone with a significant degree of compliance at all. For all school zones, the proposed fine schedule allows for a grace range of 5 miles per hour. If these two ranges captured all the vehicles traveling through school zones, I would be a very happy traffic engineer, and traffic engineers from across the world would come to Kenmore to study our ways. Traffic engineer tourism revenue might even offset the cost of our system not actually generating any real revenue when we don't issue any tickets. But we'll cross that bridge when it comes. Back to reality, if we were to set the higher fine threshold at exceeding the school zone speed limit by more than 10 miles per hour, this orange range is the share of vehicles that would be captured by the lower tier fines. The higher tier fines would be reserved for those traveling more than 10 miles per hour of the speed limit, that is 31 miles per hour or faster. Juanita Drive may be our school zone most in need of photo enforcement, and also the school zone with the highest volume of traffic passing through it. If the lower tier fine is important to our considerations of economic equity, and we knowingly enact a system where 95% of our drivers receive the more punitive fine, then that goal of serving equity is not met. Using this rule would also not serve our goal of providing a less punitive fine to drivers who are only speeding inattentively, which conflicts with our goal of creating a system that feels fair as well. An alternative might be to set a higher threshold. For example, the increased fine amount could apply to drivers who exceed the school zone limit by more than 15 miles per hour, that is to say 36 miles per hour or faster. This appears to be performing better for some locations, that is to say more in line with our program goals, but still captures an extraordinary share of drivers on Juanita Drive. It may be under-capturing for what we would consider reckless behavior insofar as looking for drivers who are speeding at substantial departure from the pack, so to speak, but I'm more concerned about overcapture than undercapture for the higher fines. What I believe is the best fit is a threshold which takes information from the speed limit, knowing that the speed limit reflects the traffic environment that will give behavior cues to most drivers. If what we want to capture with the lower fine is drivers who are inattentive to the school zone, these are likely to be drivers who started out driving at the normal speed for the road and remained driving at the normal speed for the road. A threshold relative to the speed limit appears to capture that pretty well. To echo what I said before, we should also consider that this is being done in tandem with other engineering projects and programs in the city. These studies are from 2019, for instance, and after walkways and waterways projects are complete, we expect to see lower speeds on Windward Drive throughout the corridor. Likewise, our arterial speed limit evaluation is likely to recommend a lower speed limit on Windward Drive or on 73rd Avenue or both. If not immediately, then at least a plan to get there. Reducing the speed limit on local roads is also an ongoing discussion and would have implications for this type of threshold as well. A question that was passed along to me in the intermediary time since the November 8th council meeting was how a red light violation is detected. We've had a lot of discussion about how to be fair about speed enforcement, and fairness is a constant concern for red light violation detection as well. I want to quickly walk through how detection zones work to give you some context. We don't have a camera at 61st Avenue and 522 right now, but this camera right here is used for detection at Winnetka Drive and 170. It's just to give you an idea of what it looks like. It looks a little weird because it's actually a fisheye lens, which is then squished into something that makes sense to humans. On this camera image, we would draw or map our detection zones for various purposes. The camera knows to ignore things in the red areas. We look for pedestrians inside the green areas, and we know that everything in the purple area is inside the intersection. We can track two things: whether a zone is occupied and when something crosses into a zone. We also have more sophisticated equipment that allows us to track individual objects, but that's for other purposes. Here's an aerial image of 61st Avenue and SR 522, less weird looking because it's not a fisheye thing. A detection zone might be drawn like this to find out when vehicles are crossing into the intersection. Of primary concern at this intersection are the left turn violations associated with eastbound to northbound left turn movements. The extreme enforcement of this red light violation would be detecting a violation every time a vehicle passes the stop bar when their movement has a red light. We can acknowledge, though, that this does not always happen, and many people who do not endanger other drivers still may pass the stop bar on occasion, and they might even feel really bad about it. A threshold for how forgiving we're able to be then is identifying what degree of red light violations endanger or obstruct other road users. We can look at the space in the intersection that can possibly contain the paths of other vehicles which move during the time the left turn is prohibited. If we outlined the detection zone using the area unoccupied by other movements, then this would be the most forgiving border for drawing our detection zones. If this red line were the edge of our detection zones, vehicles not crossing the red line would not even be detected as having committed a red light violation. Oh no, here comes a car. That was a close one, but no violation was detected. Other than conflicting with the paths of their vehicles, the primary reason this intersection was identified as needing red light enforcement is based on the results of a pedestrian conflict study for pedestrians crossing the controlled intersection on the north leg. Vehicles committing left turn red light violations were found to be generating pedestrian conflicts for the overwhelming majority of pedestrians crossing during peak traffic hours. A pedestrian conflict in this case is when a pedestrian must either move or be hit by a car, and only includes pedestrians who are crossing during their protected walk phase, during which time the eastbound left turn is prohibited by a red arrow, hence the violation. That is to say, we looked at the number of conflicts during legal crossing and divided that by the total number of legal crossings. We collected data on illegal crossings as well, but that data is not included in our pedestrian conflict count. Most startlingly, we saw that during PM peak hour, 83% of pedestrians experience pedestrian conflicts. Pedestrian conflicts are the most serious event that can occur without generating an actual pedestrian crash, and a high frequency of pedestrian conflicts is an indicator of where risk of pedestrian crashes is high. Having identified this issue, we have an opportunity to address it before a pedestrian crash occurs. We've already made an effort to respond to this issue, in fact. We found that the presence of police at this intersection resolved the issue entirely. However, ubiquitous in-person police presence is not feasible. Instead, there are half-gap measures in place to mitigate this currently. Right now, there's the pandemic, which reduces congestion, but there's no reason to believe that this issue won't return once congestion reaches previously experienced levels. Before the pandemic conditions, we worked with WSDOT to increase the duration of the all red time here. That's the time when every single movement has a red light. We increased it long enough to allow all of the red light violations to clear. This reduces our ability to effectively time the signals, however, which itself is unpopular in an environment where we are constantly being asked for congestion relief. Council members Kugler and File asked during the November 8th meeting about the warning period ending as the school year began. This is the schedule from last time, just to bring it up for reference. And here we have the end of the warning period. In service of the goal of making this program feel as fair as possible, I think your point was valid that we are likely to catch drivers during this first week of school who are not yet accustomed to anticipating the enforcement zone, especially after the school zones have been inactive for so long. I've revised the program recommendations to include a warning period through the week when the school zones first become active. And furthermore, I'm recommending that these first days of the fall semester be a recurring warning period each school year. I think these changes will be minimally impactful in reducing the safety provided and provide substantial benefit to soliciting public buy-in. One new thing I'd like to talk about is how we determine our school zone hours. Pre-pandemic, our school zone hours were half an hour before the start of school and half an hour after release. These hours are substantially less than other cities regionally, and we had some of the shortest school zone hours of all the surrounding cities. In order to make sure our school zone hours reflect the hours when our streets are used for school zone commuting, we worked with the schools to determine what campus hours, or determine what hours would capture when their campuses were active. Not only within school day activities, but before and after school activities as well, which are common at all of our schools. What we found was that a 1 hour period before and after school captured the majority of campus activity for all schools in Kenmore, and an additional 15-minute period before and after that hour captured the time participants in those activities would be commuting on our streets through our school zones. This 15-minute period before the start of school also protects, this 15-minute period after the start of school also protects parents traveling home after escorting their children to school or students who are arriving late to class. The same logic is applied when determining the end-of-day school zone times, except in reverse. And this, of course, is also adjusted for early release on Wednesdays. This new longer duration of school zone times, which went into effect when the schools reopened this year, puts our school zone times more in line with what we see regionally. The resulting school zone times at a glance work out like this. The exception we'll see here is Kenmore Middle School, which requested an additional 1 hour afterwards to cover their sports program, for which they expect heavy foot traffic for students afterwards. Because Kenmore Middle School starts so early, this extended timeline lines up well with when drivers would expect to see school zone times regardless. It's also worth noting that Kenmore Middle School does not currently have flashers, but they're being installed as part of the Walkways and Waterways project. So this purple timeline you're seeing here, the long one, is not currently in effect, but is proposed. The odd duck here is our newest school zone, which is Inglemoor High. Inglemoor High is a mess. It has a very complicated staggered schedule. Some students attend 1st through 6th period, others attend 2nd through 7th period. 0 period is optional. Makes it very difficult to find a one-size-fits-all time for this. This results in more hours where students are commuting. So in conversations with the school, we settled on school zone flasher hours, which are very broad coverage to account for the varying arrival and departure times for both of the staggered schedules. So far, we're actually seeing reasonably good compliance with the extended school zone time. Honestly, it's better than I had expected. And the school is grateful for the accommodation as well. And we haven't had any complaints about long school zone hours for Inglemoor either, which I definitely expected. We haven't spoken yet about the money, but there's a lot of uncertainty, and I don't want to set expectations too high or too low. We do have good estimates about program costs, though, so I'll start there. The initial cost to get set up is actually probably $0. This does vary from contract to contract, but if we have an agreement to retain a camera operation contractor for several years, they often assume the upfront cost of installing the cameras. The monthly cost, though, is rather steep, or at least it looks that way absent of revenue considerations. This is per camera, so a school zone is expected to be around $6,000 per month to operate. And that's only during the months that school zones are active. The good news, though, is that this is another area where the contractor assumes the risk, depending on the details of the contract. The cost of the camera may be set not to exceed the revenue generated. This consideration is part of the processing. The next consideration is part of the processing, our part of the processing, which is police review. Chief Moen, after discussing this with other cities with photo enforcement programs, estimates that this burden can fit entirely within existing staffing levels. Lastly, we pay for court services, and although these do not directly come out of ticket revenue, the amount we pay for court services will increase based on the number of notices of infraction we process for us. $35 per NOI is an average across all tickets. Some will cost almost nothing for violators who just make an online payment, and some will be very expensive if they require a judge's time to arbitrate. Beyond costs, there are factors which affect revenue. The biggest contributor to revenue is the number of violations which occur. The number of violations in turn is a function not only of compliance rate, but of just how many cars there are and how many hours enforcement is active. Initially, violations will be at an all-time high because if violations weren't high, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Over time, however, driver behavior will change and we'll see a reduction in violations which occur. Overall, we expect to see a 64% reduction in violations over the long term, which means long-term revenue should be estimated at 64% of current violation frequency. Lastly, some people choose not to pay a fine or contest the violation or request a reduced payment arrangement. All these factors are baked into our revenue estimate, and many of them are difficult to estimate. If we look at these possible results from issuing a notice of infraction, we can estimate the frequency, cost, and revenue for each possible way an NOI can be, run its course. In the interest of being conservative, that is trying not to overestimate our revenue, we can simplify the problem by assuming all non-payments will be contestations, meaning we pay the court fees and collect nothing, and all fines paid will be for the lower fine amount. From there, we have to estimate rates of non-payment, violation reduction, both of which vary greatly across locations regionally. We can look at two locations, for example, our locations with the highest frequency of violations currently. In a low revenue scenario, this is for Arrowhead Elementary School in Juanita and Kenmore Middle School in 73rd Avenue. In a low revenue scenario, we see under $500,000 between these locations. In a high revenue scenario, with a lower degree of non-payment and a lower degree of reduction in driver misbehavior, we see nearly $4 million across two locations. These estimates are based on real numbers experienced by Seattle for the low revenue scenario and by Lake Forest Park for the high revenue scenario. In truth, though, the locations we're considering lie somewhere in between the two. Lake Forest Park, for example, does not have any photo enforcement on arterial roads, whereas we are proposing photo enforcement on some locations which are arterials. We've discussed the need for red light enforcement at 61st Avenue and SR 522 already tonight, but programmatically, we have to define how to consider all present and future locations, which may have the need for red light enforcement. Some of these considerations are set by the RCW, but it's important to consider that what we're looking at here is that the risk is present, the problem is correctable, and that the camera does more good than harm. Red light cameras, when used inappropriately, can increase the likelihood of rear-end collisions without reducing the risk of other crashes, and that is not a situation we want to allow ourselves to be in. For school zone speed enforcement, what we're looking at here is primarily the highest risk areas. And that leads us to looking at collector and arterial roads. On low volume roads, our traffic data isn't always necessarily a good indication of risk. So looking at crash areas and crash frequencies in those to allow us to lump them in with the higher frequency areas may allow us to include some local roads in our red light enforcement as well. School zone speed enforcement. Exceptions to this criteria, of course, are locations which are not suitable for red light enforcement. We don't want to do red light enforcement right at a stop sign, for example. Pardon me for getting tongue-tied. School zone speed enforcement right at a stop sign would not be a good location, even if it is contained within school zone. Also, for this first round, we have not considered locations where we're unable to collect data, or school zones such as Simons is the case for this, where the school zone was only recently implemented. Simons Road, for example, we can only just now collect data, seeing what the traffic environment is like after a school zone violation, after the school zone has been implemented. we don't have any information about compliance, which predates the school zone being implemented, of course. These are the sites that were considered for our automated speed enforcement locations. Juanita Drive near 153rd, 153rd Place east of Juanita Drive, 84th Avenue north of 150th Street, 71st Avenue just south of Kenmore Elementary, 73rd Avenue near 192nd Street, that's for Kenmore Elementary as well, 192nd Street east of 73rd Avenue, and 202nd Street west of 68th Avenue for Kenmore Middle School. All of these met our criteria. There are some other school zones, of course, but they did not meet our criteria. What we looked at was not just how many violations occurred, but what the safety benefit of reducing those violations would be. Higher speeds presents higher risk to vulnerable road users. And so being able to reduce those violations for our highest speed areas provided a greater expected annual crash reduction than reducing the number of violations for lower speed areas. And Juanita happens to be both our highest speed location and our highest frequency of violation location. So it's no surprise that the crash risk reduction on violation on Juanita came out substantially higher than any other location we considered. Following that was 73rd Avenue, south of 192nd Street. This is also a high speed location and a high frequency location, though in order of magnitude less nearly than Juanita. If we were to recommend photo enforcement at 2 locations, these would be the 2 locations where we expect to see the greatest safety benefit from having photo enforcement cameras active for school zone speed violations. Now, these numbers for expected annual crash reduction, I want to point out that they're very small, and I'm not trying to lie with statistics. I'm trying to do the opposite. This is our expected crash reduction for having photo enforcement active. The important context for this, though, is we're looking at a crash reduction that takes place only a few hours a day and for a space of only several hundred feet long. And when you look at the risk of crashes occurring in such a small time and space window, a very substantial reduction in risk can translate into a very low reduction in crashes on paper. But the risk reduction here is substantial, and we have that here as well. We see an 11% reduction in risk of fatal crashes on Juanita relative to what's present currently, and a 7% reduction in risk for fatal crashes on 73rd Avenue. That percent reduction is based on our year-round traffic and not prorated by the time these are active. The risk reduction while the time is active is actually substantially higher, but not shown on this chart. This is just a mock-up of what our 73rd Avenue treatment would look like with our speed feedback signs, our advanced warning signs, our cameras located at the crosswalk, and our existing crosswalk indicator signs as well. On Juanita, we have similar treatments of our school zone right here. Pardon me, I forgot I animated this one. And so those would be the 2 locations where we would recommend our initial photo enforcement be implemented. That's the information I brought to share. I am ready to entertain any comments or questions from council.
Questions? Anybody have any questions here? Yes, Councilmember Shrubnik.
Yeah, a couple of them. So 2 questions. One are the crashes that you list there, the annual crashes. Do we know kind of what proportion of there's very few, which is a good thing. But do we know, if they're mostly during school hours or not? And then you might have put it up, and I might have just looked away for a minute or 2. But the other question is about what is the hours of operation for the camera that is not the school zone one, the stoplight one.
Right. Okay. So the crashes that were used in this analysis were only crashes which occurred during our previously active school hours, which was 1 hour a day, 109 days a year.
Okay, cool. Perfect.
So it was a very small window to capture crashes.
Yeah, great.
Regarding the red light camera at 61st, I would expect that one would operate 24 hours a day. I would expect most of the violations would happen during rush hour.
Sure. Yeah, perfect. Okay, thank you. Sorry, I might have zoned out.
I didn't mention it.
Councilmember File.
Thank you. So a couple things. I'm really happy that we're going to have signage informing, drivers that there are, traffic cameras in the area. But I have to wonder, are we going to have don't block the box camera signage as well for those drivers who like to, push the envelope a little bit? I would assume that cars sitting in the middle of an intersection at a red light would be ticketed if caught on camera, right?
Right, that's an excellent question. Don't block the blocks is a very hot topic right now in automated enforcement. Currently, only the city of Seattle is approved for a trial program for enforcing don't block the box. If that program is successful, then it may be opened up to other applications regionally. But while it is in a city of Seattle trial program, it's not something that we're permitted to implement here in Kenmore per the RCW.
Well, it's definitely something I think in the future we might want to look into. At least I would be interested in seeing us look into that scenario in the future, being that that is a problem. And
Definitely.
I see our manager has a question.
Right, can I
so
preempt you, Rob?
What?
Can I preempt you, Rob?
Yeah, I wasn't attempting to answer the question. I had another.
Okay. So Rob has actually put me in touch briefly with our advocates who are discussing regionally what traffic enforcement should be, our lobbyists. And we've had an opportunity to give input on Don't Block the Box, as well as other types of photo enforcement that are being considered by other cities as proposed trial programs. But it's probably not something that we'll have an opportunity to act on for several years.
Okay. And there's one issue that was not addressed in your presentation. And I think it's probably because it's a newer issue. And that's where our courts will be having to respond to persons who have hardship or social economic differences that are rather great. And in those cases, I understand our courts will be, whether they're making payment arrangements or are not imposing a fine, that would impact the proposed revenue, correct?
Right. So this is one of the considerations that came up when I discussed the photo enforcement program with Seattle traffic engineers. And they do receive some reduced payments or non-payments for economic hardship through similar programs. What I did for our revenue estimates was I conservatively estimated that all of our non-payments would be complete non-payments, as in bringing in $0 of revenue. So those reduced payments would actually increase the revenue that we expect to collect, because currently our estimates have those as $0 at the reduced payment category.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Mr. City Manager.
Yeah, two things. In your legislative agenda on the policy document, you do have a statement about expanding photo enforcement options, including the Seattle model, to other cities. So if there's legislation in the next session that's being proposed, we already have your authority or your buy-in to advocate for those or sign in favor of those. So Tobin, just for a process question, tonight you're looking for specific feedback on proposed locations and also on fines, are you not?
Yes, that would be helpful in making sure that we can put this photo enforcement proposal in its final form.
Yeah, I'm just very distressed that it's out there in the public that we're doing this for financial gain. And I just, yeah, I've got serious issue with that one.
I understand.
There's no compliance data is another.
Pardon, can you repeat that last?
There's no compliance data.
Compliance data
or enforcement data to back it up.
Enforcement data, no enforcement data to back up the photo enforcement for red lights or for school zones?
At that intersection.
So
red lights.
The reason that we don't have any enforcement data for that red light is because when we stationed police out there, they were unable to write any tickets because the problem resolved entirely. So the presence of enforcement itself was completely effective at preventing that issue. I think that the red light detection at that intersection is also likely to be very effective. I did not even include that intersection in our revenue estimates because I expect it to be so effective.
Any other questions? Any other comments? Councilmember Shrubnik.
Sorry, I meant to say this earlier with my comments. You know, I appreciate that we're hearing this now, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, the next time we hear it, we're going to be asked to approve code, and that's going to be at the same meeting where we have the public hearing. I guess my request would be, you know, normally we hear these and we get public comment, and I forgot that we're not going to have public comment today, which I think is really disappointing. So I guess if there's a way to have public comment, then time, then approval, that would be great, because it just feels like we're going to get comment, we won't be able to respond, and then we're in approval. Yeah.
I'm 100% willing to take process cues from you guys. I've been working out the schedule with John and Rob, and that can be something that we can incorporate in our schedule.
Cool, great.
Yeah, kind of off the cuff, what I'm thinking is you can have your public hearing in January. I think it would be January 24th with code language at that meeting, and then final adoption in February.
That'd be awesome. Thank you. I appreciate you considering that.
So that would be 4 touches, which is great.
Councilmember Kugler.
Thank you. I have a little bit of feedback and a couple of questions, I think. So first off, I want to thank you for that very detailed presentation and appreciate your dry sense of humor and delivery and all of the data. I think the locations, to me, I think the locations make sense. It's supported by some of the data and traffic analysis that you've evaluated. I wondered if you specifically wanted some feedback on the thresholds of the different fines. To me, it seems like we're not trying to capture a ton of revenue through this. We're trying to really change behavior, you know, remind people that this is a school zone. I think to the extent that this can protect pedestrians against cars, like this is a good thing for us to do. And if it can decrease behavior over time, I'm all for that. And so I think that, I can't remember the exact options you were giving, but for me, like leaning towards that very last option, I think it was, where it's a smaller percentage at the higher speed and higher rate, to me felt okay, given what we're trying to achieve.
That's the option I'm recommending as well. It's the one that is flexible in that it takes into account the regulatory speed limit, which gives, which incorporates information from the traffic environment in order to kind of adjust to how people are expecting to use the road. When they're not paying attention to the school zone, they're going to be driving probably according to those cues.
Councilmember File.
Thank you. And you were looking for feedback for locations tonight. And well, I absolutely can support the locations of Arrowhead and Kenmore Elementary locations. I really wish we could add a third location of Simons Road up near Inglemore. I think that's an area that needs to be addressed. But I believe that would be up to council. So I'd like to propose accepting your recommendations of the Arrowhead Elementary location and the Kenmore Elementary location. And I'd propose adding a location of Simons Road.
I definitely agree that Simons Road is a good candidate for photo enforcement. The novelty of that school zone right now is my hesitancy for that. I think critical to the success of this program is soliciting public buy-in. And I would hate to appear disingenuous by implementing a school zone and immediately generating revenue from that school zone. I'm afraid that's what the public perception would be. I believe the next summer, after we've had a full school year of Simons Road, and we've been able to determine whether our photo enforcement, not next summer, sorry, a year following the initial implementation of our photo enforcement program, I think would be a great time to consider the success of our previous 2 locations, our initial 2 locations, and consider the addition of Simon's Road or any other locations which may warrant photo enforcement. I think that staged approach is likely to not only give us better data about how Simon's Road is behaving after we've implemented the school zone, which, like I said, is performing better than I expected to. I certainly do expect that there's a high degree of violations there. Even in our well-performing school zones, we do see a high degree of violations, as I showed on one of those charts. But having that data in order to substantiate our need for Simon's Road having photo enforcement, I think that will be really helpful in making a program that solicits public buy-in.
And most importantly, the main 2 arterials that are recommended are part of the thoroughfare of persons who try to escape the 522 or the 405 fees, impact fees. So I understand that traffic fees with traffic cameras are very common with people from out of the area. And so if we can help people drive better and safer in our community and protect our community, I'm all for it.
All right, any further questions? Thank you. Next item on the agenda, resuming in-person meetings, Mr. City Manager and City Attorney.
So, Your Honor, I'm just back to the photo enforcement. What we're assuming is we're going to go with Tobin's recommendations on fines,
Yeah,
thresholds, and the locations he's recommending. I just want to be clear that that's what we're moving forward with on
right.
with the public hearing in January. Okay. All right. All right. So the other item. So, as you all know, because of the pandemic, we've been meeting 100% Zoom and city council meetings, but a meeting or 2 ago, you brought up the idea of resuming council meetings in person and Zoom starting after the first of the year. So we looked into it, and Don Rayton, our city attorney, looked at what the governor's orders are and what requirements are if we were to meet in person. So the first thing I'd like to do is turn it over to Dawn, and she can go over those. And then after she goes over the governor's requirements, then I can talk about some operational issues.
Thank you, City Manager Carlindsey. First of all, I wanted to just very quickly say, woe is the presenter who has to go after such a complete PowerPoint presentation from Mr. Bennett Gold, especially when that presenter doesn't have a PowerPoint of her own. But I'm going to instead really provide a summary of what you already have in your agenda packet. So I think to do that, to start, I want to take a step backwards. And as mentioned by Rob, is that when you have, you all know this, pre-pandemic, when you had public meetings, the state law under the Open Public Meetings Act really regulated how those meetings would occur, the rules and regulations. But of course, it's not normal anymore. And we are facing still the COVID-19 pandemic. So instead of the OPMA, we have those rules, the COVID rules, if you will, that I attached to your agenda, or that were attached to your agenda. I will not read those. Those are for you if you have any additional time, but I will briefly go through those to give this council the framework to continue the conversation of what an in-person meeting might look like in this time of COVID. And just again, those 4 COVID rules. The first is the Governor's Proclamation 20-28.14. The second is the miscellaneous venues guidelines, which is essentially requirements for holding business meetings. There is the State Department of Health statewide face coverings order. And then there's also the Governor's Proclamation 20-25.17. as I noted, I will provide the legal framework so you could better understand the constraints. And then Rob will also continue and identify operational aspects of those rules. I would like to note, though, that if you see the 4 rules, there's been many, many versions of them. The first proclamation has been revised 14 times. The last proclamation has been revised 17 times. And I fully anticipate that the rules we discussed tonight will in fact change and evolve depending on the status of the pandemic. So the first proclamation, which I believe is the most important to you considering an in-person component, is Proclamation 2028.14. Surprisingly, when it came out, it actually, the general rule was prohibiting meetings. So it wasn't saying you can do this or that. It actually said meetings are prohibited. And then it provided exceptions. The first exception said, unless it is or they are online meetings. So you can hold meetings if the following components of an online meeting is met. It is not conducted in person, and at a minimum, allowing the public to attend, at a minimum, they have to have telephonic access and be able to hear each other at the same time. Exactly what we're doing now. But it's very important, you'll hear that requirement echoed in the next several rules, which is that the persons attending the meeting, both council and public, must be able to hear each other at the same time. So that's the first exception to the prohibition. And the second prohibition that came out later in September 2014 was the addition of the in-person component. So the exception says the council may, at its option, hold an in-person component in addition to the online. So of course, you have to have both. And if you want to have the in-person component, you need to meet 4 requirements. Essentially, you have to comply with the miscellaneous venues guidance. You have to allow any person who wishes to attend the public meeting with the in-person component to do so at a physical location. So it's either the primary location, meeting location, or an overflow location. And again, that location must allow all persons to be able to hear each other at the same time. And then if there's an in-person component and something goes wrong, such as the audio online or the in-person component fails, or someone comes in without a mask, then there's a requirement that the meeting be recessed and that compliance be restored if possible. And if compliance cannot be restored, that meeting must be adjourned, continued, or terminated. The fourth element to that proclamation is essentially what you're doing now, is to the extent practicable that those wishing to participate both in person and online have the ability to listen and speak through operable telecommunication devices, cell phones, laptops, etc. So the takeaway for that first proclamation, the big umbrella of rules, is that it has to be both an online meeting, it has to be with an in-person component, and essentially all persons need to be able to hear each other at the same time. The miscellaneous venues guidelines, which is a requirement of the proclamation, is actually quite easy. It used to have numerous requirements for capacity or distancing, no more. So the one requirement of holding a meeting under that guideline is simply that the city would be required to comply with the Secretary of State health order on face coverings. And the most recent one is 20-03.6. And I'm just going to go straight into that. Essentially, and we all are probably very familiar because we do this daily, is that Department of Health requirement states that all persons in the state of Washington must wear a face covering that covers their nose and mouth when they are in a place where any person from outside their whole household is present, or a place generally accessible to any person who's outside your whole household. So that's the general rule. Again, we're all day-to-day complying with that. And of course, there's a few exceptions. There's quite a few in the rule, but I just noted the ones that would be more applicable to a meeting, such as an exception for eating and drinking, to confirm identification. If anybody's been at the airport lately, you'll know that one. If you can't wear it because of an emergency, or when you're outdoors, except for, of course, very large gathering. This rule does not apply to children younger than 5, with people with medical conditions, or persons with disabilities, or conditions that would prevent the wearing of a face covering. So again, the takeaway is that all persons at a potential in-person meeting with the Kenmore City Council would be required to wear face coverings, and the city would be required to enforce that. And then really the last rule, which is the Washington Ready Proclamation 20-25.17, is simply reiterating what I just discussed, which is that a governmental entity may not allow an individual to remain in an indoor space without compliance of the Secretary of Health's face covering order. So you'd be required to enforce that. So these are the legal framework, or this is the legal framework that applies now, which of course could change. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have regarding the framework, understanding that Rob will next discuss the operational aspects.
Did I see in your synopsis here that we had the right to exclude anybody that was not vaccinated?
So what you would need to do is consider and adopt for yourselves an emergency rule, like you've done in other circumstances, creating such a restriction, similar to what King County has done, of course, with restaurants and gyms, but it would be a legislative act. You can't just hold someone at the door without an enactment.
Councilmember Fowl.
Tried. Thank you. You know, about that last topic just raised, you know, I believe King County Public Health has a really good stance on kind of the safety aspect of ensuring people are vaccinated or have proof of a negative test within 24 hours beforehand. It's my understanding that according to the state law, and in recognition of people's beliefs, that we should respect those differences, right? I would want to make sure that either people were vaccinated or had a negative test 24 hours beforehand, and screening on site if they were going to visit the site, so that, you know, there is no evidence of a fever when they're walking in the door. You know, we have the equipment, we have the scanners, so we can track if there is a problem. I am concerned about the newest variant and what that means for our community safety at public meetings. This Omicron variant it's vicious, and we're still learning about it. And we're in a phase of, as a nation and in our state and our county of finding out whether how this is going to impact us, impact our communities, our public. And so I want to make sure and ensure our community is safe attending these meetings. And we won't really know the full impact of OmicronCon for at least 2 to 3 weeks. So I just want to make sure I'm listing this concern and just driving it home that I am really deeply concerned. I want to make sure that we don't have an issue in our own community. And I would want to make sure that equity issues of masks could be provided on site. And the issues of people who can't afford, like a COVID test to prove negative 24 hours beforehand. I think we have to address socioeconomic issues to participation in government.
Anybody else?
And if there are no further, I see.
Deputy Mayor?
Yeah, I absolutely think that we need to require vaccinations from the public if we're going to go back to in person. If you talked to me a couple weeks ago, I would have thought that we'd be going back to in person sooner than later. Now I'm a little bit less excited about getting back in person with everything that's happening. But I think it's just the responsible thing to do. Vaccinations are free, and if you choose not to go that route, that's your decision. You can participate through Zoom or over the phone. There are multiple options open to folks, but right now, getting vaxxed is the bare minimum that folks can do to, in my opinion, be a member of our society right now as we're dealing with this. And if they're not willing to do that, then they can participate remotely. I have no qualms with us having a vax requirement for in-person participation.
Councilmember O'Kane, then Councilmember Shrubnik.
A few weeks ago, I was with Deputy Mayor Herbig and feeling ready to come back in person. But then when I understood the logistics of it and that we have to wear masks, I actually think our expression is important when we speak. It's a big part of who we are and trust. And so that mask, just that we as people who are representing our community, I'm all for wearing masks and being safe, but at the same time in our role for us to be transparent and clearly communicating to our community is incredibly important. I also think what we're doing right now is working. We're getting great community participation, splitting it up. I know we can do it. I just don't know that the benefits are worth it. And along with, then we have the new variant. Concerns we're going into winter, fall, where people get sick anyway. I think erring on the side of public safety, I prefer staying on Zoom, and I did not want to be in this space. I'd like to be in person. I would like things to go back to where they were, but I don't think we're ready yet. So I guess it's not even a question, but I just want to say, I'm comfortable with staying on Zoom for a while longer and revisiting this in the new year.
Councilmember Shrubnik.
Well, I think everybody's made really good points. And I feel like we could do this. Before thinking about, requiring vaccination cards, I guess I'd want to really find out from staff what kind of position that puts them in. I don't feel like that's necessary. I feel like the mask, between our masks, the public's masks, that would be sufficient. But that's just where I'm at. So the main thing was, before considering the vaccination, I'd want to gauge how staff are feeling about that and what that would imply, because there's a lot of complicating factors there, and I don't know. Yeah.
I've been gung-ho for a long time getting back together. I think we should get back together until Omicron came along, and Yeah, I think we ought to be waiting a while. That's just my personal opinion. Councilmember O'Kane, you had something else? Okay. Yes, Mr. City Manager.
I was talking to a nearby city manager the other day, and she feels like she's the one to blame for all these variants. And what I mean by that is anytime she says, okay, we're going back in person, a new variant pops up. And so she was, she and her council were ready to go back to in person in January, but now Omicron's here, and now she's kind of backing off that. So the cities, I haven't formally polled everybody, but my sense is that most of the cities around us are still 100% Zoom. I know Woodinville's meeting in person, and somebody told me that Mill Creek is meeting in person. I'd love to pick the brain of the Woodinville city manager. I haven't had a chance to yet, but just to find out all about all their logistics and things. We were going to have a mock in-person council meeting. We were hoping before tonight's meeting, but we ran into some scheduling issues, and I think we're going to try to have that mock meeting next or later this week. But yeah, just some more operational things to consider. So you've talked about masks and then mask enforcement. So I was watching a Walla Walla City Council meeting where they're hybrid and they're in person, and they mentioned that at a previous meeting they had to adjourn the meeting because people in the audience weren't wearing masks and wouldn't leave. And so their only option, I guess, was just to adjourn the meeting. I guess the other option is to forcibly remove them, but that would make for lots of YouTube hits. The other thing to consider is, do you as a city council want to socially distance at the dais? I've been watching in-person meetings and I haven't seen any social distancing among council members, but they're all wearing masks. Another thing to consider is screen management. And I think that's easy. I think we can figure it out, but I've seen a couple cities show you how not to do it. Like for example, they'll have one council member online and they take up half the one council member takes up half the screen, and then the council's at the dais, and so you have 6 tiny little council members with masks on, and then one large head, and you can't tell who's speaking. But Pierce County Council, I think they've got it nailed down. They have the council dais screen as the pinned screen. And so they make sure they just always show that screen. And if there's a presenter, they'll let the presenter show their screen. But so there's things like that need to be worked out. Councilmember Marshall said that in his work, one thing they're doing is the judge and others that are, they're having the Zoom in-person combo. And Councilmember Marshall, you might explain this better than me, but my understanding is that you can log in on Zoom as your own account, have your picture, but then mute everything, mute your mic, mute your speaker. And then when you talk, it'll come over the microphone, but you're not getting the double feedback. Councilmember Marshall, is that accurate? Did I explain that correctly?
Yeah, that is it. Yeah. And then also when the Zoom in, especially for defendants, then the image appears, person's face appears. They turn on their video and their audio and they're up there. And then there's still people in the courtroom, the judge, the clerk, the attorneys.
Yeah. As for vaccine mandate, yeah, we would like some policy direction from you on whether to mandate it for attendees or whether just to mandate it just for yourselves. If it's for attendees, I would like to find out from other cities if they're requiring vaccines for attendees and what enforcement and monitoring looks like. So I'd want to do a little bit of homework and call around and ask other cities what they're doing. So those are some of the operational issues.
All right. Anything else on the topic? Councilmember File.
Thank you. I would want to have partition separations between, like the clear plastic partition separation between council members and hopefully staff to help keep everybody safe if we re-enter the public space in the council chambers. And, I believe that King County did a legal assessment of vaccine mandate versus option with testing. And I think we should have our attorney look at that and see what we can learn from it. I think it's important that we consider people of differences, whether they have medical underlying issues and cannot be vaccinated, or religious issues, and request and require testing 24 hours beforehand. I'm all for supporting a required vaccination of council. I'd be happy to show my card anytime. But I just think we have to be responsible, and I think we have to be accommodating. And our state legal system has kind of set a framework for addressing people's needs and differences
We're
as they
still working
relate.
hard to keep this concise, so let's try to do that.
Thank you.
Councilmember Kugler.
Thank you. I agree with many of the points that Councilmember O'Kane made. I just wanted to mention that, I think if we meet in person, I would want us all to be wearing masks. We need to. And I think it's not ideal talking behind the mask and people can't see us. But I think that issue of logistically having that simultaneous audio is going to be maybe an operational challenge that we're going to have to tackle at some point in time. Like when we're ready to go in, I think we're still going to have to make that work. And I think the previous system that the council used prior to COVID is not going to work. So it might be worth us just testing, and we're kind of kicking this down the curb for now, but we're going to have to tackle that, I think, in a different way. So we may want to start experimenting sooner rather than later.
Right. Yes, Mr. City Manager.
I wholeheartedly agree. And so I think a little bit later this week, we're going to experiment. And then I am recommending, and I think you agree with me, that we are going to have the retreat on January 8th, Saturday, in person at City Hall. We'll spread out and everything, but we're going to try to have the retreat in person unless you tell me otherwise. But I think what I'm hearing is that other than the retreat, you want to just stay on Zoom for a while and not do it right at the beginning, not go back in person at the beginning of the year.
And kind of my feeling, because we don't know with Omicron exactly what we're up against yet, I'm not so much in favor of having the retreat in person. But that's just my opinion.
Yeah, give me some direction on that too.
Yeah. Anyway.
I would actually like direction on that too.
Yeah, we can certainly do that. Deputy Mayor?
Councilmember O'Kane was before me.
As much as I would like to meet in person for the retreat, and I could go either way, but if there's council members, if there's a consensus or majority, I can go with it on Zoom retreat. I think we were effective last year. I do love being in person though. There's a benefit, but at the same time, it's a meeting just like this.
Okay.
The same things count.
Deputy Mayor?
I was going to say, I think it's hard to really forecast out even 4 weeks kind of where things are going, because things keep.
But unless we know more.
It's just hard to figure out if in 4 weeks we're going to feel like we can sit in a room together for 8 hours straight and feel okay about it.
Councilmember Shrubnik?
Yeah, I would suggest that the retreat presents more risk than the meetings, actually, because if we're going to be taking off masks, where it's longer exposure time as well. I also don't feel like it's fair, so to speak, to privilege us to meet together when we're not willing to do that for the public. So I would prioritize meeting with the public before I would prioritize meeting in person with us, even though I
Well,
love
let's
it.
make-
We do.
Let's make sure we all get to the city manager with our opinions on this. All right, nothing new on this topic. Then this is a special meeting. That's it. So let's.
Can I just recap? I just want to be crystal clear on the direction I'm getting. So
Sure.
I'm hearing 100% Zoom for the retreat and 100% Zoom into January. And we'll reassess in January and see what we want to do. I would like a minimum of a few weeks notice before we go online because we need time to work out bugs and stuff.
Sure.
So, okay, so we're assuming 100% Zoom for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I hear that the plan at King County is to give 6 weeks notice before they're going back to in person, and they don't know when that will be at this point, but.
All right. December 13th, regular meeting, December 14th, special legislative delegation send-off event, and December 20th, a special and regular meeting. And with that, Mr. City Manager.
Just note that on the December 13th meeting, it is actually a special meeting. We're having a 6:20 exec session on.
Okay, so it's not a special meeting. It's not a regular meeting, it's a special meeting.
That's right.
Okay, we need to correct that in the agenda. All right.
6:20 start time, special meeting on December 13th.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great evening.
Night, everyone.
Hi, thank you.
Good night.
Right.